And with Gideon, the judge Gideon, and we covered mostly chapter 6. I think I touched some things in chapter 7, but we'll just kind of give some type of overview of it all before we get to the heart and the meat of it. Judges came before kings. Judges came before kings. Judges were appointed by God and in response to the prayers of Israel from the death of Joshua through Samuel. And it was at that time that God was the king of Israel. But you remember what happened after the judges? They looked around at other people and said, well, now we want a king. And God was, I'm the king, and God allowed them. Of course, they chose the one that God wouldn't have chosen for them. Saul, he allowed them to have the king that they chose, and that ought to be a lesson to teach us that we don't even know how to choose our leaders. And then we experience the sins of our leaders creates problems for us. So judgeship is different from kingship. A king's son would be king, but a judge's son could not inherit judgeship. And so that's why, judges would be selected or picked, if you will. Judgeships were also not exclusively for males, but kingships were exclusively for males. Deborah was a judge, and she was a female, but there is no history of any female king, if you will. Judges' responsibilities were to protect the people within their borders and boundaries. If, wherever they were within their borders and boundaries, it was the responsibility of the judge to make certain that the people would be protected. So he or she had to have some type of military acumen, some type of strategy to set things up so that they could defend, again, their boundaries and their borders. When kings came along, the same thing was the king's responsibility, but however, two things. One, a king had to be male, but also kings were responsible, ladies and gentlemen, to spread holiness, not just within their borders, but beyond their borders and boundaries. Did you get what I said? A king had the responsibility of spreading holiness. Now, when I say spreading holiness, I ain't talking about holiness like giving out tickets, but certainly influencing, let me say it like that, godliness, influencing living righteous, not just only within their confined boundaries and borders, but even beyond them. So you see some of the differences between judges and kings. And we have to hold on to that as we get to thinking about this, because there is a vast difference between judges and kings. And oftentimes when people like to try to defend female roles as it relates to religion or God, or extending righteousness or leading people in righteousness, they like to call on Deborah, but Deborah was a judge, and the judge did not have to. It was not his or her responsibility to lead the people in righteousness, if you will, beyond their borders, or spreading holiness, if you will, beyond the borders of their camp. Gideon was one of those judges, and I elected to begin to study him. Look at my opening thought on your paper. It says, do you struggle to believe God when he calls you to something more in him. Luann, don't listen to me tonight. I don't want you to listen at this lesson tonight. You have the freedom to be in here tonight and not listen, okay? That's an inside joke. We had dinner with them last week and learned some things. But listen at what it is. The question, do you struggle to believe God when he calls you to something more in him? You know, you might think you're doing enough already. You know, you're kind of complacent or kind of satisfied. You're looking up at the, your schedule is, the way you like it. You in control of it. You in charge of it. And you do enough stuff. And then God calls you, Dr. Ingram, to something more in him. Now, please understand this. God don't call you to something more out of him. So when people say, well, I don't understand the call of God. Well, I help you understand the call of God. First of all, the call of God is always going to be something what? In him. Something that he can endure, something that he, sanctifies, something that he can join you in, if you will. And so the question we have to ask ourselves, how do we respond? Because Gideon showed us some things and how we respond when God called us to something more in him. We work in this part of the ministry and then get called to be involved in something else. And we say, man, I don't want to do that. Matter of fact, like Gideon, we actually hide. We don't want pastor, none of the leaders to pick us. So we work in places where you can't see us. I'll help that make sense to you. When we read in chapter 6, verse 1, which I told you that the enemies of God had been pillaging and confiscating and taking all of their crops and things of that nature of God's people for over 7 years. These Midianites, for over 7 years, they had been pillaging and all of that. And Gideon, I'll guess I'll reread it, but he was actually hiding out in the wine press, working with the grain. Now, what does that mean? I'm glad you asked. Normally, where you pulled out grain and the oats and the stalks from the seeds and all that, normally that didn't happen in the wine press. That happened on something called the threshing floor. Well, all my country people at. Okay. The threshing floor, which was a floor that was made like concrete, and an ox or a heavy oxen or some type of strong animal would be, and they would go around and they would crush the grains and they would be separated. And, you hear a winnowing and anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, all right. Well, my point is this. Threshing floors were exposed. Wine presses were hidden. So when it says that Gideon, please catch this, is in the wine press threshing out grain, the wine press was normally not used for grain. It was used for pressing out what? Grapes. So Gideon is hiding. He won't come in the main church. He stay in the children's church. Because he don't want pastor to ask him to do nothing. Gideon-Nets. you understand what I'm saying? Of course, he also was doing it because I told you they were being pillaged and, and stuff like that. So he was trying to work in a place to where the Midianites would not come and be able to confiscate, the grain that he was trying to hide from them. So that's another reason why he was doing that. And just for review, in chapter 6, verse 12, can you work with me on that? Chapter 6, verse 12 of the book of Judges. We're going to be looking from chapter 6 through 8. I'm going to spot through them if I can tonight, but I want to begin at verse 12. This is just some of the review. In verse 12 of Judges, chapter 6, verse 12, the book of Judges, chapter 6, verse 12. God called Gideon a valiant warrior. But remember, he calls him that when he's what? Hiding underground in the winepress. There it is. Judges 6, chapter 12. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, remember that, O valiant warrior. I need you to understand something again. He hiding in the winepress. He ain't fighting nobody. Matter of fact, one of the reasons why he hiding is outside, of course, trying to store food, but he don't want to fight. But notice what the Lord tells, the angel of the Lord tells him. He said to him, the Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Yeah, hiding out in the winepress. But he calls him this. First of all, let me help you out with that. Y'all, God doesn't see us as we might be. He sees us as we are. I mean, he doesn't see us as we are. He sees us as we can be. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm glad about that right now. He sees Christ Jesus. When he sees my sins, he sees they are covered, they are paid for. God is calling Gideon. He sends his angel of the Lord, theophany of God, to go and speak to him. And he's literally telling him ahead what you going to be. A valiant warrior. Even though at the time he's not. If you've ever been a part of church, any ministry, whatever like that, and you've been invited to, they call them ministry fairs, or just trying to get a part of it, you know, someone either sees the potential in you, or they see, you know, the way that you function even before you've been called to a ministry, and they will, not in the sense of prophesy, but they will state what you can be and what you can do, you know, even before you do it. And certainly God can. So God sends this angel of the Lord as he's hiding underground, working in this unexposed wine presser. He calls him a warrior. God called him and used him. Please understand this. There may be some people who call on God and don't wait, you know, for God to do what he wants to do. But if God called on you, he going to use you. God doesn't call you to just say, just check it. You know what I'm saying? You still with me? God, no. When God calls us in the ministry, he's calling us in the ministry to what? To use us. He's calling us in the ministry to use us. Now, he may not use us in the place that we think he should use us. And that's why you got to stay still and listen to all of the instructions, as we see, you know, that Gideon had to learn exactly what he wanted to do. Because sometimes, you know, we want to be called into something and we'll position ourselves to say, that's what he told me. But when God calls a person, he uses them. In verse 12 and verse 16, God reminds him that he is with him. We saw it in verse 12, but let's look at verse 16. Because he says, the angel of the Lord said to him, the Lord is with you. Look what he says in verse 16 to him. Again, reminding you about the calling of God. But the Lord said to him, surely, what? I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as what? One man. In verses 17 to 23, Gideon's response to all of that was happening to him was he began to worship. Ladies and gentlemen, notice he begins to worship. When you get the chance, we talked about that, but he began to worship. And the calling of God, it cannot be without the worship. I hear of people all the time talking about, you know, they got this feeling or this calling on their life or whatever, and as it relates to worshiping, they may attend church, but they don't worship. God's going to call you into ministry. I'm telling you, your response, the only proper response, is what Gideon did in verses 17 through 23, and that is to worship. But then I want to show you something in verse 24. That's what I'll get to as I remind us. He built an altar. Notice what it says in 6:23. It says, then Gideon, you know, he's got his worship on and all of that. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and named it the Lord is Peace. To this day, it still stands, if you will. What building an altar is, ladies and gentlemen, it's a sign that Gideon's life now is consecrated. Do you understand what I'm saying? Gideon, his life now has been properly prioritized. Do you understand what I'm saying? Whenever you see it says a person is building an altar, that means now they have consecrated their life. They've been set apart, if you will, in their service and their worship to God. So Gideon builds this altar, telling us, along with this calling, along with the worshiping, that he has reprioritized his life. Ladies and gentlemen, we got to ask ourselves, if God called us into something, are we willing to reprioritize our lives? 6, verse 30. As a result of living and serving for God, guess what wanted to happen, y'all? The people wanted to kill him. Did y'all hear what I just said? If you're going to worship God properly, if you're going to prioritize the things of God, if you're going to speak for God, if you're going to serve God, let me tell you, people in your own house might want to kill you. It says, then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son that we may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has cut down the Asherah which was beside him. I think I'm going to show you later in the text, what his name has to do with that. Yeah, I'll wait till we get to that. But folk going to want to kill you. When you publicly serve God, when you show people whose side you're on, when you're faithful to the call of God, folk are going to want to, yeah. I was reading something, and Doc, you might know who said it. I know it may be Spurgeon, but it's one of those old reform. I don't know who said it, but I know they said something like this. It said, when pastors used to preach, the people wanted to kill them. The problem we have nowadays is folk don't want to kill no pastors. Now, the guy who said this, I think, like 15th century. So this ain't something that happened yesterday. But when the men of God used to preach, folk would want to kill them. John the Baptist, when you speak the truth, folk would want to kill them. He said the problem we have today with preachers and pastors is nobody want to kill them. Because the message is so compromised. The message is so worldly. The message is so, amenable, convenient. It's so watered down to, the sinner doesn't seem like a sinner anymore. Preaching back in the day when the preacher would preach, folk would want to kill him. Wow. In verse 33, Gideon, he gets his house in order. Now, you got to remember, his house wasn't in order at first because you had a dad who was worshiping the gods of Baal and all that. They had all of those things inside the altars and all of that. But Gideon, he goes back and he gets his house in order. Look what verse 33 said. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the sons of the east assembled themselves, and they crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Verse 34. So the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and the Asbarites were called together to what? To follow him. So Gideon gets his house to order, and then the enemy comes and attack him. And that's what I want you to see. So after you've learned to worship God, after you start speaking and living God, and folk want to kill you, listen, God uses battles outside of us to build the right kind of faith inside of us. Did you hear what I say? God uses battles outside of us to build the right type of faith inside of us. You wonder why these things are happening, why these things are threatening, why? Because God allows those things on the outside to happen so he can shape the faith that we need to have on the inside of us. Yeah. He does that with Gideon. He does that all through the Bible. You see that as he allows these things to happen that we would think shouldn't happen. The enemy comes and attacks him and them. And he says in verse 34, that's what I want to say. It says, so the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Ladies and gentlemen, when we are doing God's work, the Spirit of the Lord is going to give us everything we need to accomplish everything that God has called us to accomplish. See, God is, first of all, you got to remember, God is not looking and seeing who is best, who is good, because there's none good, right? But God. There's none righteous, but Him, right? None of us are so good that none of us have so much strength that God said, I need to borrow that strength. I need to borrow that faith. I need to borrow his intellect or her intellect or that capability. That's not what God called us for. God don't call us to use, because God need us. So when God calls us into ministry and to serve him and to the positions of service, whether it's husband or pastor, it doesn't matter. What he wants us to know is he's going to give us everything we need to accomplish what he's called us to do. Y'all know why they was having problems. We read it. They were being what? Disobedient. We read that last week. That's why they were having problems. They were being disobedient. The leaders and I, we were talking last night. We were just being, I said, man, let's just be honest. Let's just be honest with ourselves. We can't look at that. Let's look and see if we've been obedient. Because if we've been obedient, then God said he's gonna provide. But if maybe the reason why he's not providing is because we haven't been obedient. And God ain't got no problem with not providing for 5, 6, 7 years, 40 years in the wilderness. Hold it. 400 years in Egypt. I don't have no problem. Because he's trying to get us to do what he's called us to do. And you got to remember, he had called the nation of Israel to be his representation in the earth, in the world. And they backed out on that, and that's how they ended up in Egypt. The Spirit of the Lord will always give us everything we need to accomplish what God has called us to do. And so when we're looking at what God has called the church to do and all that, y'all, some things are no-brainer. Well, we can't do that. What do you mean we can't do that? That's what God calls it. That's what the church is to do. Well, what do you mean? What it is we don't want to function with faith. We don't want to reprioritize our schedules. We don't want to do all those things I just got through talking about. We're afraid to truly build an altar, meaning that we are now consecrating our lives to God and not to our own agendas. So with that, my question again is, do you struggle to believe God when he calls you to do something more in him? Because if so, chapter 6 of the book of Judges ought to help you, ought to motivate you to understand what God, in fact, is doing. Look at my opening statement. It says, in accomplishing the mission God set before him, Gideon proves himself to be, let's look at these verses, gentlemen, proves himself to be a faithful man, a mighty warrior, a strong leader. Look at what Judges 7 and 17 says. Now we're going to be kind of tracking through the chapters 7 and 8. He said to him, look at me and do likewise. And behold, I come to the outskirts of the camp and do as I do. Now you got to remember, this is Gideon. This the guy who was hiding underground in the wine press. You understand what I'm saying? Even though he was helping his tribe about, getting the grain and all of that. But here he is now saying, do what I do. He said, look at me and do likewise. Leaders, are y'all hearing what I'm saying? Whether male or female, look at me and do likewise. See, we have a responsibility to be what? Models, to be role models, to be imitators of God. And we shouldn't have a problem with telling folks to look at me and do what I do. And listen at this faithful leader now. He who once was hiding, now he's standing up, he's saying, do what I say, or do what you see me doing. So you see how God has been with him, has encouraged him to say and do and to live and to serve. Y'all, when you see a man of God with integrity, don't think he's smart. He's really surrendered. When you see a man of God who's willing to make a fool, or a person of God willing to make a fool of themselves, whatever, it's not that they're stupid. They have surrendered. So here he is now, this wine presser hiding in the underground, now standing and going to the top of the mountains and the camps and saying, do as I do. We see the strong leader. And then we see his diplomacy in Judges 8. And actually, I think that should be 1 through 3. I said 8:13, but I'm sorry. I think that should be 1 through 3. Look at Judges chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, or 1 through 13, or something like that. You can see that he actually, he's caught in a conversation, if you will, with some people, and you see him, they present something to him, and he uses diplomacy, if you will, to lead the other men, and that's what it is. Yeah, he uses diplomacy in that. And then go to Hebrews 11:32-34. This is what I want to get to. Remember, this guy who was hiding in the winepress, using it as a threshing floor, this nobody. Look in Hebrews chapter 11. God finds it fitting, because of his life, to be mentioned in the hall of faith. He says, what more should I say? Because, prior to this, he names all of the people, Noah and all the people in the hall of faith. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 is about. He says, and what more shall I say? But time will fail me if I tell you of Gideon. Time will fail me if I tell you Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and you remember Judges, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained the promises, and what? Shut the lions' mouths. Verse 34. Quenched the power of the fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies what? To flight. This is the testimony that he gives of men like Gideon and some of the other judges and some of the other prophets and kings. He goes from a nobody, surrendered to God, for God to mention him in the listing of men's like Abraham, Moses. Gideon is listed amongst those men. Not because he's smart, but because he's what? Surrendered. Yeah, that's what he's telling us in all of this. So let's just do a quick overview of it, and we'll look at a couple other things. Yeah. In Judges chapter 7, verse 1, then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, he camped at Mount Gilead above the camp of the Midianites. In verses 2 through 3, we see the Lord sent the fearful away from Gideon's army. We talked about that, he sent 10,000 who were scared, and then he sent another, 97 away who lapped the water wrong. And then in verses 4 through 6, I think we talked about that last week, the army was still too big, so he tested them at the water's edge. And then in Judges 7, verses 7 through 8, the 300 who lapped, they were retained, and the rest was sent home. In verses 9 through 14, Gideon scouts the Midianite camp, and he hears. Let's look at that, verses 9 through 14. I like that. Now the same night it came about that after the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. Now remember, he's telling him, I've given it. I'm actually working this same lesson for some senior pastors who, Lord willing, will be teaching this Thursday, but I'm working it from a leadership point of view. And one of the things that I noticed in all of this is everything came from God. I'm giving you this. I did that. I did that. I did that. So none of us, even as senior pastors or leaders, can take any credit for anything. Everything he said, I did. He said, but if you were afraid to go down with Purah, your servant, down to the camp, and you will hear what they say, and afterwards your hand will be strengthened that you may go down against the camp. So he went with Purah, his servant, down to the outpost of the army that was in the camp. So he snuck up on the camp. And now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the sons of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts. So it's just, just a host, a large army. And their camels, I'd like to say this about camels are like in war, they're like tanks for us today. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Camels would be like, everybody shooting with bow and arrows, and you got camels, So, and the camels were without number, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. So Gideon sneaks up on the camp, because God told him to go. And when he sneaks up on the camp, go where God tell him to go, he hear this guy relating a dream to his friend. That's what it says right there. And he said, behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent laid flat. His friend replied, man, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Judges. Now you can understand, Gideon and his guy is listening in this concept. They don't know he's there. So it's not like Gideon walked up on their enemies. He walked up on them and, and they, hey man, what y'all talking about? No, he was hiding, but he was close enough to hear this conversation. And what he's hearing, oh, y'all hear what I'm saying? Because God is confirming to him that I'm finna use you in this place just like I told you. So he goes down and he hears the enemies talking. And one of the guys says, oh, that's nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel. God has given Midian and all the camp into what? His hand. So you think Gideon now is doubtful about what he's been called to do? He hear the enemy saying what God has said. We shouldn't have to always test God and hear from somebody else. We do need to get to the point where God said it, that settles it. But you got to remember what Gideon is in his faith. And you got to remember he's growing, he's maturing, and he's getting ready to go, first time to go to war. This is a wine presser, from one of the least tribes, and he's getting ready to go to war against all of this great army, if you will. So after he scouts the camp, he hears the dream that God ordained that they would overthrow. And then in verses 15 through 18, Gideon is strengthened, and he prepares and he divides and prepares his army against the Midianites. So he breaks the 300 men up in camps of, I think, 100 each. And then verses 7:19 through 8:9, Gideon's 300s out of the Midianites, they pursue them across the Jordan. In verses 10 through 21 in Judges 8, they defeat the remnant of the Midianites, and they capture 2 of the kings of the Midianites. In verses 22 to 28, Gideon refuses the kingship. Yeah, let's look at that. So once they, what happened? They go, do they fire a gun? No. Do they use a weapon? No, their weapons are simply torches and pottery. He didn't say take AK-47s or nothing like that. They go into the enemy's camp with these torches, and then he said, when I blow the trumpet, break the pots, and you make a crashing noise when all these people sleep, and they wake up, and he says, say for God and for Gideon, and they start killing each other, those who are fighting, and then those who run, they run after them and kill them, and then they get the 2 leaders, chop their head off and bring it back. Yeah. Notice what it says here. The men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, because he's again, the guy who was in the wine press. You know what I'm saying? Rule over us, both you and your sons, and also your sons' sons, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midianites. Remember what I told you? Judges' sons did not inherit judgeships. Kings' sons inherited kingship. But these people are ready to talk Gideon into saying, man, everybody last name, anybody got Gideon blood in them, they can be our leader. If you die, let your son do it. And after that one die, then your grandson can lead us. Watch out how people build you up, ladies and gentlemen. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you, but the Lord shall what? rule over you. Verse 24. Yet Gideon said to them, I would request of you that each of you give me an earring, though. See, some things are happening now. Gideon started believing the report. Gideon wanted a large pastor's anniversary. Let me stop. Gideon said, I don't want to be the king. I don't need to be no ruler. I mean, don't make me the ruler over you, but, it's something you want to do. This is what you can do. Notice what he said. He said, I request of you that each of you give me an earring from his spoil, for they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Then he goes on and says, and they said, we will surely give them. So they spread out a garment, and every one of them threw earrings there for his spoil. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent of ornaments and the pendants and the purple robes which were on the kings of the Midian, and beside the neckbands, and they were all on the camels' necks. So they were, they had looted the stuff from the people that they had. Yeah. Gideon made it into an ephod, and he placed it in his city, Ophrah. And all Israel did what? Played the harlot with it. So that it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift their heads anymore, and the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. I'll tell you a little bit about that. So what happens in chapter 8, something happens in chapter 8, and actually, listen at me, leaders, Gideon's leadership and his legacy get marred because he started to do some things that God didn't tell him to do. And he sees an opportunity to kind of enrich himself. He sees an opportunity to, and I don't know how he thought he deserved it. I just read the text to you. He said, I don't want to rule over you, but I'll tell you what I will do. I will take some of that. And then you got to understand what an ephod was. That was the thing that the Levite priests wore. That had the 12, diadems and all of that stuff, the Urim and the Thummim, and had all them jewels on it to represent. And so you got to understand, so now here we got, him, he builds himself an ephod, and not that he's been called, because remember I told you Judges, everything I said for a reason. Judges didn't have to lead in any spiritual vein. They weren't responsible for spreading holiness or righteousness beyond, not judges. They were responsible for military, protecting the people within their borders. But Gideon, even though he say, I don't want to do that, look how his leadership get marred, because now he decides on his own to do something on his own that God did not call him to do. And when we finish reading the rest of this chapter 8, you'll see some other things happen that also not only just marred his legacy, if you will, but his son Amalek did some other very, very bad things. So Gideon refused to be the king. Gideon, 29 through 32, 71 sons, he died, and they were buried in this city. And then verses 30 through 35, Israel forsake the Lord, and he began to serve Baal, and likewise he was unfaithful to Gideon's house. Now, if you turn over, I think, it says, now the first thing that leaped out is to me today, is that what your page say? I got like 15 pages up here, was why was the position of Gideon's camp, why would it merit a single paragraph all by itself? God does these things for a reason. Gideon is referred to by his name, Gideon, through most of the narrative. But here at the end of chapter 8, his name his father gave him, Zerubbabel, is mentioned specifically. Now, Gideon, that's what I was trying to say earlier to you. Notice the irony here. The term Gideon is from the root word that means to hew, to cut down or to chop down, something like a woodcutter or What do you call the guys that work in the forest? Huh? Lumberjack. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So he's a woodcutter. That's what the name Gideon means. But also used in Scripture as a warrior who cuts down men before him. Because notice what he did. His name is Gideon. His father called him Jerubbaal. But the name Gideon that he's given also speaks to him not only moving from cutting down trees to not cutting down what? Men. As he did that army, the Midianites and all of them. But Jerubbaal is a compound name that means to contend, or to contend with one who what? Contends with Baal. And you got to remember what he did. Gideon contended with Baal when he cut down his altar, when he cut down the Asherah pole, which was they used that as to worship in the sense of fertility, goddess, and all these other things that stood beside. So he cut down the Asherah pole, he tore down the altar. So isn't it interesting then that when Gideon was named by his parents, his name was like a prophecy of what God would do through him in his life, because he hewed down the altar of Baal and he hewed down the Midianites who had oppressed what? Israel. Yeah, his parents called him Jerubbaal, the one who contends with Baal, but God, his name Gideon, was the name that showed that later he would be used by God to do those very things against the enemies of God and the enemies of God's people. Yeah. I wonder what our parents were thinking when they named us. Yeah. It says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon when he was threshing wheat, I'm going back to chapter 6, in the winepress, and held him, O mighty man of valor, he was agreeing with the prophecy of his name, which had borne his whole life. He had wore his whole life. Perhaps this is why Gideon's father was so quick to accept the overthrow of Baal's altar. Because you got to remember, his father and the people in his family had set that altar up. But his father quickly accepted it, seeing that the fulfillment of his name was in it. That God would use him to be the one to deliver the people. And then right after that, he sees how he uses him in leadership to deliver him from the Midianites. It says something that they had peace, ladies and gentlemen, for almost 40 years. Let's look at that. Verse, 28 in chapter 8. I want to read that. Verse 28. Did I say that right? I'm sorry. Yeah, verse 28 in Judges 8. Verse 28 in Judges 8. I want to begin there and read down. It says, so Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift up their heads anymore. And the land was undisturbed 40 years in the days of Gideon. Did you get that? So after the battle, that, they kind of had peace for 40 years. So they're like, under the judgeship of Gideon. What does that tell us? Y'all, when our leaders do what God tell them to do, and we do what he leads us to do for God, we can have the peace of God. Do you understand? Even though all those other little things happen, in spite of those things and his legacy get marked, because he did it, it says they had peace for 40 years. The land was undisturbed for 40 years. So they were able to grow the crops, to glean the crops, to do all of that stuff. Verse 29. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons who were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. Gideon got caught up in that polygamy thing. You see how? You see what happens? He did an ephod, and he started letting people, he started believing the report, Yeah, my pastor's something else. His concubine who was in Shechem also bore him a son and named him Amalek. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a ripe old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash, Ophrah, and the Abizarites. So notice what happens with all of this. Peace for 40 years, the crops get to grow, no enemies disturb them or anything like that. How I want to say this. Gideon don't have to struggle or fight in the wars, nothing like that, so he's just growing fat, if you will. He got the ephod, I don't mean fat, I mean, Pht fat. I think that's the way y'all say it. Let me use another word. He gets besides himself. Let me stay in my lane. He gets besides himself, and he started listening at the report and people saying stuff about his leadership because they got peace for 40. I can only imagine, 10 years into it, somebody go see, the judge because he ain't the king. Gideon, how's it going, man? Oh, man, I'm just, like bro, man, on the fifth floor, just chilling. Because there's no threat. You understand what I'm saying? And so he grows complacent. He gets to thinking that, what he did was so great till it will last forever. You understand what I'm saying? And so now he makes this ephod, which he shouldn't have done. And in a sense, they begin to kind of worship that thing. And that's where, he gets out of line because the semblance of that ephod, that breastplate, that robe that only the high priestly righteous people wore, he got one of those made, and I'm sure when folk came over, it probably was like, on the stand somewhere when they walked in, and I don't know, he may, hey, bow to the ephod, that's mine, He got beside himself. You know why sometimes God allows people to always struggle? Because the soon as he let up, they're going to get beside themselves. Yeah. So that happens. Now he's playing polygamy. He know that ain't right. He got all these gals, wives, and all that stuff. And then he had one by somebody outside it, and then she give birth to one named Amalek. And you have to read the story about Amalek. That boy, he messed up a whole bunch of stuff. So look at his legacy and his story and how it get marred, and because of vindictiveness and all of this stuff, because he believed in report, because God used him, even though God did it all, but God used him, and he started thinking it was him who did it. It says, now the ephod, a godly made ephod, was worn by the high priest as he performed his tabernacle duties. No judges could go in the place where the high priest would go. It was like a vest worn over a floor-length robe of blue. The breastplate containing the gemstones, the 12 tribes of Israel, was attached to the ephod by golden chains within the breastplate of the Urim and the Thummim. The Urim and the Thummim, through which the high priest inquired of the Lord. Remember, he's not a high priest. What they were and how it worked were not told. And I think it would be wise to not conjecture either. I believe Gideon made a golden ephod as a memorial of his victory over the Midianites, for Hebrews were forbidden to make what? Images. So he kind of went around the thing. A Hebrew couldn't make a golden calf. They couldn't make an image of some type of 4-footed animal or anything like that. But watch this. But the Bible don't say. The Bible don't say I can't make a ephod and put one over there. Because he literally, in a sense, began to kind of worship that thing. Yeah, so I believe he made that as a memorial for his victory over the Midianites, for Hebrews for beginning. He might have thought an image of a garment did not transgress the command, because again, he he made an image of a garment. He didn't make a golden image of any kind of calf or animal or anything like that. Why an ephod? Well, that's a good question. It might be that because the Lord spoke to Gideon, the memorial was of the thing through which the Lord spoke to the high priest that, at any rate, it was not the wisest thing to do for him to make that ephod. None of the previous judges of Israel had done anything like it. Even though they had also won great victories, no one had made an ephod and proved it to be a snare of what? Idolatry to Gideon's household afterwards. Because notice what happens, almost like David. The ephod went to engage in polygamy, to engage in this, and engage. You understand what I'm saying? Y'all, when we crack that door on just the littlest thing, it opens up the door for everything else. I'm not saying we're to live perfect, even though God tells us, we are to be holy because he is holy, but we're to be persistent. But when we know what not to do, y'all, we can't compromise it and thinking that what happened to somebody else is not going to happen to me. Because it always proves to be just that. So this very thing that he tried to leave there as a reminder of his great victories, it became a snare of idolatry to him and his house afterwards because his sons and others followed in that sin. All that is to say this, ladies and gentlemen. God uses imperfect people to accomplish his what? Perfect plan. So with everything I said about Gideon, I'm not trying to tear him down or anything like that, but I need to remind you of who he is and what he did. He was an imperfect man, but God used an imperfect man to fulfill his what? Perfect plan. He did it with Moses. He did it with Joseph. He did it with all of them. Jacob. All of them. Everybody listed in the Hebrews chapter 11 were imperfect men that God used to fulfill his perfect plan. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully this lesson tonight led us to believe this. Because as you read it, you'll see that God did all those things. Y'all don't believe that if you have some type of success that you did it. Because if you believe you did it, you'll build an ephod. You'll make an ephod. You'll begin to worship some victories and some accomplishments, and that'll become your idol. And thus, generations after you will be messed up because of you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.